I always call myself a possibilist, neither a pessimist nor an optimist. I believe both can be paralyzing. I'm a possibilist because I know the possibilities. For many years now I have awarded the Right Livelihood Award, the so-called Alternative Nobel Prize. So I know that solutions exist for practically all the great problems now challenging us. But they have not been implemented so far, and that's why we are now in a pretty dire situation. Even the US military, for example, now expect a global energy crisis by the year 2015. And a recent study by the Oxford economist Dieter Helm about climate change comes to the conclusion, as he puts it, that the happy political message that climate change can be met without any effect on living standards in the rich countries is unfortunately not so. The studies, for example, by Lord Nicholas Stern have totally underestimated the effects which growing climate change will have on our societies. They seem to believe that life can go on as usual, but this is of course not an environmental problem. It is a challenge which will threaten our economic security, which threatens our military security, threatens our ability to improve lives for the hungry, for the poor, basically, everything. Now, much time has been wasted over the past 30-35 years since this truth was known. We had globalization. The American recipient of the Right Livelihood Award, Professor Herman Daly, says this was the last attempt to escape natural limits to growth by growing into the economic and ecological space of other countries. The problem, of course, is now that we have done that, we are now reaching what some people call global peak everything. All limits will hit simultaneously all over the world. And so we're heading for a turbulent, chaotic transition, whatever way it goes. Things can change very rapidly. It was Lenin who said that sometimes nothing happens in decades, and then suddenly decades happen in weeks. And we saw one very frightening example of this after the Katrina hurricane, when a big US city, New Orleans, suddenly within days became a lawless territory just ruled by gangs with guns, while youth gangs of young men who grabbed all the scarce water resources being thrown down, while women and children and the old stood by and got nothing. So our civilization can break down very, very rapidly if we don't manage this transition right. Now, what are the key messages? I think, first of all, the Western development model is not globally replicable. The natural scientists have a word for this. They call it the fallacy of the successful first step. You've done something somewhere, you think you can just replicate it. Now, why is this not so? What does natural limits mean? Well, they mean that natural laws cannot be outvoted by democratic majorities. People always seem to assume that if we do too much to save the climate, then somehow we'll lose the next election. Well, the climate won't really care about that. You cannot negotiate with melting glaciers. You can negotiate with financial creditors, but not with glaciers. And also, nature provides no bailout packages like governments have done for the banks. There is also the question, of course, if this development model is sustainable here now. We are not as rich as we thought. We are now finding that we have three challenges. First of all, much of the growth which has made us believe we're so rich has been so-called funny money. The growth rates which the financial sector has produced are not replicable in the real economy, on which ultimately we depend, where real wealth is produced. Many people who saw their pension funds invest in financial derivative products were worried. Now they sort of find that their pensions are invested in BP shares, and they have even more reason to worry. You also have the problem that we have lived off the environment and at the expense of future generations now for many years, and those bills are now coming due. And thirdly, we know that we can't continue living like that in the future, which is why growth is going to be much less, and much of it is actually negative. The question is there going to be any sort of real growth at all once you subtract the costs? So these are the challenges facing us, and people sort of dismiss all this and say, oh, but China and India, the Chindia model. Now in China, the CO2 emissions generated by the Chinese growth, if they continue like this alone, will make China uninhabitable. And the Chinese leadership knows that, and that's a big challenge. But the idea that they have somehow found a different way to do this, or they will ignore these environmental challenges, is completely naive. And in India you have a model which has so far benefited a very small part of the population, while the big majority are increasingly unhappy, and the very little reported in the West, the Naxalite Maoist rebellion which took power, as we know, in Nepal, is growing rapidly in India. So we are faced with global challenges. We have found in the World Future Council, which I founded, this does not mean that we need to sit back and wait for a global consciousness revolution or a global political revolution or some fantastic new invention. We do need entrepreneurship, we do need inventiveness, but the policy incentives we can introduce tomorrow would make sure that even with present technologies, with present knowledge, we could solve many of these problems facing us. And the belief that there is no money is of course a fallacy. As John Maynard Keynes once said, whatever a society can do, what it has the resources, the labor, the knowledge to do, it can also finance.